Hey guys, tonight we're heading back hundreds of years right into the middle of a biting medieval winter. Picture it. A small village tucked between frosted hills, smoke rising from crooked chimneys, and children wrapped in whatever scraps of cloth could be spared. The wind rattles through loose shutters, snow piles against the door, and you, unlucky soul, are about to spend the night on a bed that's little more than a pile of straw and rags. Let's be honest, you probably won't survive this with your modern love of memory foam mattresses and central heating. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening right now, post your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You push open the heavy wooden door of a peasant's cottage. The smell of smoke and damp wool hits your nose instantly, thick and clinging. The hearth crackles faintly, but it's nothing like your modern thermostat. This fire is small, smoky, and struggling against the drafts whistling through the cracks in the walls. Children sit near it, rubbing their little hands, waiting for the coals to glow bright enough to offer more than a fleeting sense of comfort. And yet, this is as good as it gets. Fire is life, and every ember counts. A small child shuffles toward you, wrapped in a patched linen shift, her bare feet red and raw from the cold floor. She clutches a wool scrap, thin as paper, but to her, it's a treasure. Bedding in these homes wasn't the thick quilted comforters you're imagining. It was layers of whatever fabric the family could cobble together, worn-out tunics, bits of sacking, maybe even an old cloak if fortune allowed. Historians still argue whether poorer families kept any dedicated blankets at all, or if children simply slept under the same clothes they wore by day. And honestly, judging by the chill in this room, you're not betting on the blanket theory. Now, the mattress. Don't get your hopes up. Most children slept directly on piles of straw or reeds laid across the floor, flattened under weight and time. Some families added a coarse sack filled with chaff, husks, or even bracken leaves. Sounds rustic, right? Until you realize straw attracts bugs and vermin. So yes, you'd occasionally be sharing your bed with a mouse or two. Imagine a midnight tickle that's not a sibling, but something with whiskers. Sweet dreams. What strikes you next is how close everyone sleeps. In one corner of the single-room cottage, children are lined up together, heads tucked beneath the same rough covering, bodies pressed tight for warmth. Privacy? Forget it. If you're lucky, you might share with only a sibling or two. If not, it's the whole brood. 6, 7, maybe even 8 of you lined up like spoons in a very cold drawer. There's comfort in that, though. Body heat means survival, and even today, historians admit that medieval peasants were experts at turning necessity into ingenuity. You notice a cradle by the hearth, hand-carved, rocked smooth by use. Babies were often swaddled tightly, their arms pinned like little burritos. Not just to keep them calm, but because people believed swaddling trapped heat and kept evil spirits at bay. Quirky detail. Some parents tucked small charms or herbs into the cradle, bits of rosemary, a carved cross, or even a coin. Because when nights were long and freezing, a little superstition felt like extra insurance. Outside, the winter storm beats against the cottage walls, and the sound is more than weather. It's a reminder. Food is low, firewood scarce, illness near. Children knew this from their first winters. The world was harsh, survival was fragile, and sleep was something you did in snatches, not in luxury. You curl up tighter into the straw, coughing a little as the smoky air fills your lungs. Your throat itches, and you wonder how many nights like this children endured without falling ill. Answer: too many. And yet, there's something strangely peaceful here. The dim glow of embers, the sound of a lullaby sung in a mother's soft, tired voice, the rhythm of children's breathing pressed side by side. Even in the cold, even in the damp, there's a fragile warmth stitched together by community and love. You can almost believe you'll drift off, wrapped in the muffled heartbeat of the medieval night. The smoke clings to your hair and clothes as you trudge deeper into the heart of the cottage. Straw mats crunch underfoot, thin but surprisingly resilient, the only padding between you and the frozen floorboards. You rub your arms and notice how every corner of the room is layered with the same simple materials: sacks, old tunics, patches of wool, and even the occasional feather or down collected from farmyard birds. It's all improvisation, a patchwork of what the family could spare after tending to fields, animals, and the ever-hungry hearth. Historians still argue whether this layering method was standardized in villages across Europe, or whether every family developed its own tactile hierarchy of warmth. You glance at the children huddled near the hearth. They look impossibly small, faces flushed from the fire's fleeting heat. The smell of smoke is everywhere, thick enough to sting your eyes and make your throat raw. It's not unpleasant in a nostalgic way. It's the scent of survival. You can practically feel the history of thousands of tiny faces pressed into these same corners, breathing in that same acrid comfort. Fringe detail. Some villagers reportedly tossed a handful of dried herbs into the fire. Rosemary, lavender, even juniper, to create a pleasant smoke meant to calm restless children. You inhale cautiously, skeptical, but the idea lingers, like a medieval version of aromatherapy. You notice the straw under your fingers. It's prickly, uneven, and every time you shift, it rustles like dry leaves. This is the closest thing to a mattress most peasant children ever knew. And yet, ingenuity shows itself in tiny, inventive ways. Families would layer straw over soft sacks, and occasionally add a thin blanket of wool, even if threadbare. The heat from the fireplace and the bodies pressing into the pile make it bearable, though not exactly luxurious. You might think, why not just build a bed off the floor? Well, some did. Simple wooden frames with a straw-filled sack on top. But most cottages lacked the space or resources. Efficiency ruled over comfort. The communal nature of sleeping arrangements is striking. You watch as toddlers and slightly older children tuck themselves together, forming miniature heat clusters. Even the older siblings participate, lying strategically to share warmth without bumping heads or elbows too harshly. Sometimes livestock, chickens, small goats, even the occasional dog, were brought indoors during the coldest months. Historians still debate the hygienic risks versus the survival benefits of having animals in the sleeping area. You wrinkle your nose at the thought, but secretly appreciate the ingenuity. Body heat is body heat, no matter the source. Above all, the textures of the room fascinate you. The wattle and daub walls radiate cold in thin patches. Smoke hangs low, trapped beneath a roof thatched with straw. Every element of the dwelling plays a role in insulating the children, from the placement of mats to the position of the hearth. Fringe tidbit. Some villagers would even sprinkle sand or clay on the floor beneath the bedding to draw moisture away from the straw, preventing mildew and making the beds last longer. Ingenious in its own grimy way. You shift again, feeling the straw compress under your weight. The children around you are murmuring, whispering, and occasionally coughing. Life is rough, but rhythms have emerged. Each family member knows how to maximize warmth, how to protect babies from drafts, how to endure the long, bitter nights. And as you settle into your straw nest, you realize that even in this smoky, prickly environment, there is comfort, structured, communal, and tactile, a silent choreography passed down through generations. The warmth of the hearth doesn't last forever, and soon you notice the clever strategies families employ to stretch every fleeting degree of heat. You shuffle closer to a cluster of children, feeling the gentle press of their tiny bodies against yours, each one radiating whatever residual warmth they can muster. It's a human radiator, a medieval version of central heating, albeit one that occasionally kicks you in the ribs if someone shifts. You begin to see how sharing heat wasn't just comfort, it was survival. Historians still argue whether these huddling practices were primarily for warmth or also served as a subtle form of social education, teaching children cooperation from the crib onward. A mother moves among the children, adjusting blankets and layering scraps of cloth where they've slipped. You notice how carefully she tucks a small goat hide beneath the smallest infant, something a bit softer than the usual straw. Fringe detail. Some families would even stuff extra clothing into old sacks to make temporary pillows for infants, believing that keeping the head slightly elevated helped ward off cold drafts and, in some local superstition, nightmares. You poke at the layers under your fingers. It's not luxurious, but you realize there's method to the madness. Each extra layer counts. You watch the older children pile against the wall, backs pressed to the wattle and daub, knees tucked to maximize body contact. Sometimes they share their own clothing with younger siblings. Hoods, tunics, socks. Each transfer of warmth a small act of generosity. And then there's the presence of animals. A small dog curls near the door. A cat drifts lazily across the floor. Parents believed their breath and body heat could stave off the chill, though historians still debate whether the comfort outweighed the risk of fleas or disease. Still, the children seem unbothered, and you admit it. The furry warmth is oddly reassuring. Clothing itself becomes part of the heat equation. Layer upon layer of wool, linen, and leather can trap a surprising amount of warmth, though it comes at the cost of flexibility. Fringe tidbit. In some regions, children wore multiple shifts of undergarments, tucked and pinned in intricate ways, almost like wearable insulation blankets. You can't help but laugh softly, imagining a toddler waddling like an overstuffed sausage. But the practicality is undeniable. The evening stretches on, and you notice the rhythm of the cottage. Whispered stories, a lullaby hummed under breath, the creak of the door as someone fetches more firewood. These routines are not just tradition, they are adaptive strategies for survival. Every movement, every shared blanket, every sleeping position has been honed by years of trial and error. You can almost sense the accumulated knowledge embedded in these practices, generations of experience distilled into a choreography of warmth. And just when you start to sink into the fragile comfort of this collective heat, you remember the smoke curling above your heads, the uneven straw beneath, the frozen wind outside. It's harsh, yes, but it's ingenious. The village doesn't have central heating, electric blankets, or memory foam. What it has is resourcefulness, intimacy, and a silent understanding that everyone, child and adult alike, depends on each other to survive the night. You settle in closer, feeling the heat radiate not just from the fire, but from all the small bodies pressed together. A quiet proof that sometimes survival is warmest when shared. You notice a small cradle tucked into a corner near the hearth, rocked gently by a mother who hums in a soft, rhythmic cadence. The baby inside is swaddled so tightly that it almost looks like a little linen burrito, arms pinned securely at the sides. Swaddling was more than just a snug way to keep infants warm. It also restricted movement, which villagers believed prevented developmental issues and even mischief, though historians still argue whether swaddling truly had long-term health benefits or if it was mostly about convenience and sleep management. You reach out to touch the woven crib mattress. Coarse straw bound inside a cloth cover, and you feel the resilience of centuries of trial and error in child comfort. Midwives played a crucial role here, not just at birth, but in the early months of a child's life. They advised mothers on how to layer blankets, how to keep the infant's head warm, and which herbs to place near the sleeping child. Fringe tidbit. In some areas, midwives recommended placing a small pouch of garlic near the cradle to ward off evil spirits, which you can't help but find slightly amusing. Though garlic does have a noticeable scent, and maybe the baby slept better simply because the adults were distracted, these caregivers were the original sleep consultants, blending practical knowledge with superstition in a way that was both charming and essential. Portable cradles were common among even modest families, allowing infants to be moved closer to the fire during the day or into the parent's bed at night. You watch a toddler being lifted carefully, a parent shuffling across the straw-laden floor, balancing the cradle to avoid spilling a layer of loose straw. Keeping babies near heat sources was a constant practice. You can almost feel the tension of trying to provide warmth without smothering the child in smoke. Layered swaddles, fur scraps, and the occasional cloak were all improvised to create a microcosm of warmth inside the drafty cottage. Sentimental objects also had their place. A carved wooden toy, a small cloth doll, or a bit of embroidered fabric might be tucked near the infant's head. It's hard to imagine the layers of meaning in these humble items. They were comfort, protection, and often a link to absent family members. Fringe detail. Some families believed placing a coin under the pillow of a newborn would ensure luck or wealth later in life. You smirk at the practicality of having tiny humans invested in medieval economics before they can even walk. Swaddling, bedding, and keepsakes were intertwined with ritual and observation. Parents watched infants carefully, adjusting layers if the room became drafty or the fire dimmed. Every small action carried weight. Too many blankets and a child might overheat too few, and frostbite was a real threat. Historians still debate whether these intricate practices were universally effective or if they merely gave families a sense of control in an uncontrollable environment. You sit back on your straw mat and notice the subtle ingenuity in all of it. Something about human creativity under pressure makes you marvel at the quiet, deliberate choreography of survival in these early months. And as the night deepens, you realize that cradles and cots weren't just furniture. They were carefully managed ecosystems. Every fold of fabric, every swaddle, every protective charm contributed to a child's ability to endure the bitter winter. You feel the delicate balance between warmth, comfort, and superstition, a rhythm as natural to the cottage as the crackling of the fire itself. It's intimate, it's strange, and above all, it's life sustained in miniature forms, guided by centuries of observation experience, and, yes, a little creative imagination. Night deepens, and the village settles into its quiet, rhythmic pulse. You can almost hear the collective sigh of peasants closing the day's labors behind them. The slow settling of smoke in low ceilings. The soft shuffle of feet moving to stoke the dying embers. Children follow these rhythms instinctively, though in a much gentler, smaller way. You notice the older siblings performing their own little chores before curling up, fetching the last pieces of firewood, coaxing a stubborn animal closer to the hearth, or helping tuck a younger brother beneath a patchwork blanket. Historians still argue whether these early responsibilities were purely pragmatic or intentionally designed to teach social cohesion and survival skills. You trace the path of the hearthlight across the walls, and it highlights the sleeping arrangements, a careful hierarchy of warmth. The youngest, most vulnerable children huddle closest to the fire, swaddled or layered with whatever scraps of fabric are available. Slightly older children are positioned just beyond, bodies pressed against the walls or each other, using shared contact to preserve heat. Fringe detail. In some regions, children even slept on top of straw-filled benches raised slightly off the floor to avoid cold drafts. A small, inventive nod to elevation as insulation. You shift slightly, testing how the heat migrates from body to body, noting that survival is as much about positioning as it is about layering. Chores and work dictate the night's quiet rhythm as well. Some older villagers take turns maintaining the fire, ensuring it never goes out entirely. The occasional crackle punctuates the otherwise soft sounds of the night. Murmured prayers, whispered lullabies, the faint snuffle of a dog or cat curled near the door. Children, sensitive to these rhythms, often drift to sleep in predictable patterns, though some nights are disrupted by cries or coughs. Fringe tidbit. In a few documented villages, small watch shifts existed, where older children or teenagers monitored infants or the fire, a kind of medieval babysitting with life or death stakes. You watch as a mother hums a low tune, rocking a cradle gently. The lullaby is soft but patterned, a rhythm that echoes the night's overall cadence. Sometimes she sprinkles a few drops of warm broth onto the child's lips, a mix of sustenance and comfort. You notice how light and shadow play across the straw and walls, shaping a visual lullaby that works in concert with the auditory one. Historians still debate whether these rituals were primarily soothing or a method of subtly conditioning children to adapt to nocturnal hardships. The ambient sounds, layered with heat and motion, create a kind of meditation on survival. Even the occasional cough or rustle becomes part of the nighttime orchestra. You feel how integral this rhythm is to the children's sense of security. The predictability of tasks and the cadence of human activity stabilize the mind, even under freezing temperatures. Fringe detail. Some families would employ small charms above the cradle, pouches of dried herbs or stitched symbols to reinforce this sense of routine and protection, a tactile and visual counterpart to the auditory environment. By now you understand that night time in the village is far from idle. Every sound, every movement, every touch is intentional. There's an unspoken choreography that keeps everyone warm, safe, and slowly sliding toward sleep. The fire dims, bodies press closer, and the lullaby winds down. You feel a curious intimacy in these coordinated rhythms. Comfort drawn not from luxury, but from shared awareness, attentiveness, and sheer human ingenuity. And as your eyelids grow heavy, you realize the night is not empty or silent. It is alive, pulsing with the subtle mechanics of life and survival in a medieval winter. Cold bites sharper as the night wears on, and you feel it seeping into every crevice of the cottage. You glance at a small child whose nose is pink and chapped from the chill, and a pang of empathy shoots through you. Illness was an ever-present companion in medieval winters. Coughs, fevers, frostbite. Even with careful layering and constant vigilance, children were vulnerable. Historians still argue whether the winter mortality rates were more a product of exposure, malnutrition, or infectious disease. And as you watch, you realize the truth is probably all three working together in an unforgiving symphony. You notice the parents moving with purpose, adjusting blankets, rubbing hands and feet to stimulate circulation, and coaxing shivering children closer to the fire. Fringe detail. Some caregivers would place warmed stones wrapped in cloth near a child's feet, believing that localized heat prevented frostbite and illness. You tentatively touch one. The heat radiates slowly, a primitive but surprisingly effective method. The mixture of observation, intuition, and folklore is fascinating. You can almost see how survival relied as much on creativity as on raw resources. Herbal remedies litter the cottage. Small pouches of dried chamomile, mint, or yarrow tucked beneath pillows, dangling from hooks or hidden in straw. You watch as a mother crushes a few leaves into warm water to soothe a cough. Fringe detail. In some villages, a tincture of crushed onion mixed with honey was a go-to for chest congestion, a pungent remedy you imagine would make the cottage smell simultaneously medicinal and slightly alarming. These small interventions could make the difference between a night of manageable discomfort and one that turned into a medical emergency. Even the older children take part in care. A teenager huddles a younger sibling against the wall, brushing straw away from her face, ensuring her head is not covered by loose smoke. You see a delicate choreography here. Each action is deliberate, a combination of instinct and learned technique. Historians still debate the exact extent to which children themselves contributed to their own survival strategies. But in the tiny movements and whispered directions, you witness clear evidence of agency in the most precarious circumstances. You pause to observe frost forming on the window edges, crystal patterns that seem both beautiful and dangerous. The cottage is a fragile ecosystem. Fire, bodies, straw, herbs, and vigilante care all working to fend off the cold. Fringe tidbit. Some families placed bowls of water near the hearth to create humidity, which prevented overly dry air from aggravating coughs. A surprisingly sophisticated understanding of environmental health. You marvel at how tiny adjustments, clothing layers, body placement, the addition of an animal or a heated stone made a tangible difference in survival. The night stretches long, punctuated by intermittent coughs and the occasional murmur of a child rolling against the floor's straw bedding. You feel the strain of vigilance in every parent's slow movements, the quiet attentiveness of older siblings, the constant negotiation with frost and smoke. And yet, amidst the harshness, there is ingenuity, patience, and care, a network of small acts that together preserve life. You realize that warmth in these cottages was never passive. It was earned through observation, resourcefulness, and a deep communal sense of responsibility. You nestle closer to the cluster of children and, for a moment, feel the quiet miracle of a night survived. Soft voices float through the smoke-laden air, and you realize that warmth isn't just physical. It's also a matter of sound. Parents hum lullabies, low and steady, weaving rhythm into the night to soothe children against the sharp bite of winter. You feel the vibrations in your chest, a subtle pulse of comfort that seems to seep into the straw beneath you. Historians still argue whether lullabies served primarily to calm infants, or if they were a subtle means of imprinting social norms and oral histories onto the next generation. Regardless, their effect is undeniable. Tension eases, small eyes flutter closed, and the household collectively exhales. You notice small charms and amulets hanging near cradles and beds. A carved wooden animal here, a stitched cross there, perhaps a sprig of rosemary tucked into a tiny bundle of fabric. Fringed detail. Some families even pinned miniature horseshoes above sleeping children, a practice believed to catch the cold before it reached the body. Superstition and practicality overlap here. A quiet acknowledgement that even the most attentive care might need a little magical backup. The children don't seem aware of the symbolism. They simply take comfort in familiar shapes and objects, tactile touchstones in a chilly, unpredictable world. Stories are shared in whispers. Older siblings recount fragments of village tales while toddlers gape, absorbing every detail in wide-eyed fascination. Sometimes these tales contain practical lessons: how to navigate a frozen river, where the safest firewood piles are, which herbs relieve coughs, intertwined with mythic creatures or moral lessons. Fringe tidbit. In some areas, parents told stories of ice goblins that prowled at night to scare children into staying close to the fire. You can't help but smile at the idea, though you appreciate its effectiveness. Keeping kids near warmth and supervision was critical, and a little fear never hurt. Rhythm is everything. The lullabies, whispered stories, and occasional prayers form a layered soundscape that coordinates with body heat, fire, and bedding. You notice how the cadence slows the household, turning chaotic movement into a gentle, predictable cycle. Even coughs and sneezes fall into pattern, absorbed by the collective awareness of caretakers. Historians still debate whether this auditory strategy was intentional or simply evolved naturally, but you can't deny its soothing power. The soundscape itself is a kind of insulation, wrapping children in consistency and familiarity. You pause to observe a subtle exchange. A mother passes a tiny bundle of herbs to a child, who places it beneath a pillow, muttering something under breath. This small ritual, repeated countless times across villages, blends practicality with superstition, fringe detail. Some herbs were specifically chosen for warmth, believed to stimulate circulation or even ward off nightmares that might cause shivering. It's a delicate mix of observation, experimentation, and inherited folklore that ensures the children sleep as safely and warmly as humanly possible. By the time the night deepens fully, you see the intricate web of human ingenuity: songs, stories, charms, and layered observation, all combining to create a protective cocoon. The children, wrapped in blankets, nestled in straw, bodies pressed together, drift off into dreams. You lie there, noting the subtle orchestration of care, warmth, and ritual, a symphony that has echoed across generations. In this moment, you realize that survival is not just a matter of fire or straw. It is sound, story, and superstition, working quietly and beautifully to carry children through the harshest of winters. You tilt your head toward the cottage walls and notice something you hadn't fully appreciated before. Architecture itself is part of the survival strategy. The wattle and daub walls, thick in some places and surprisingly thin in others, trap heat in pockets while letting just enough smoke escape to keep the air breathable. The ceilings are low, which seems claustrophobic at first, but it actually keeps warm air from rising too far above the sleeping children. Historians still argue whether these design choices were intentional thermal strategies or simply the result of available materials and construction traditions. Either way, you feel the effect immediately. Warmth seems to cling closer to the floor, where the children huddle together. You trace your hand along a wooden sleeping platform raised a few inches above the floor. Some cottages had these simple bunks, lined with straw or cloth, providing both insulation and protection from damp or critters. Fringe detail. In certain regions, families placed clay or sand beneath the raised platform to absorb moisture, reducing the chill from the earth below. It's a clever, low-tech engineering trick, proof that ingenuity doesn't always require blueprints or tools beyond a few sacks of dirt and skilled hands. You press a finger into the straw. The slight give reminds you how these modest beds were constantly adjusted to accommodate growth, seasonal shifts, and available materials. Smoke holes in the roof are another subtle genius. They allow fire smoke to escape while minimizing drafts, an essential balancing act in winter. You notice how the villagers arrange cradles and mats directly beneath the area where smoke dissipates slowly, catching some of the warmth before it exits. Fringe tidbit. Some families would cover these holes with small boards or wet cloths on extremely frigid nights, intentionally trapping more heat, even if it made the room smokier. You wrinkle your nose but nod. Desperate times call for smoky measures. Roof design also plays a role. Thatched roofs, thick with straw, are surprisingly effective insulators. You can almost hear the wind scraping against the exterior, but inside it barely penetrates. In some cottages, an extra layer of reeds or moss would be tucked beneath the outer thatch to create a buffer against icy gusts. Historians still debate whether this was common across Europe, or mainly a northern adaptation. But the effect is clear. Even the simplest structures were designed or evolved to maximize warmth during harsh winters. You notice the interplay between architecture and human ingenuity. Body heat, layered bedding, raised platforms, and hearth placement all intersect with walls, ceilings, and thatch to create a complex microclimate. Fringe detail. Some families would even hang thick curtains or tapestries across certain sections of the room at night, turning partitions into improvised windbreaks that concentrated warmth near sleeping children. You marvel at how something so simple, woven cloth hung in a doorway, could transform the feel of a room. Settling back on the straw, you recognize that the architecture isn't passive. It's part of a larger choreography. Every beam, wattle strip, and thatch layer contributes to survival, working alongside blankets, animals, and attentive caretakers. You feel how medieval ingenuity extended beyond what we normally call furniture or tools, integrating living, breathing systems into the very walls and roof. It's quiet, subtle, and brilliant, a hidden warmth that reinforces the layers of human effort pressing close to you in the darkened cottage. By now, You're acutely aware that survival in a medieval winter isn't just about heat, it's also about food. You notice a small cupboard tucked near the hearth, packed with root vegetables, dried grains, and a few salted meats. These provisions are carefully rationed. The less you consume tonight, the more remains for tomorrow. Food scarcity is a constant companion in these villages, dictating how well children sleep. Historians still debate whether nutrition, or the lack thereof, had a more direct impact on mortality than cold exposure. And as you glance at the meager stores, it's clear the two are inseparable. Families would often stockpile whatever they could, and children learned early the value of stored sustenance. Fringe detail. Some villagers tucked small dried herbs or nuts beneath bedding to make them accessible for midnight snacking. Though whether children actually ate them or just used them as comfort objects is up for debate. The idea of grabbing a crunchy treat from your pillow seems oddly modern. Yet here it is, centuries before snack culture existed. You reach for a small dried apple in your mind, imagining the faint sweetness against the otherwise bitter taste of winter. Labor and seasonal work also shaped the night. Children's sleep schedules aligned with chores. Those who helped tend animals or fetch water often went to bed later, while toddlers and infants were tucked in sooner. Sleep was never arbitrary. It was structured around survival needs. Fringe detail. In some villages, older children were allowed to sleep near the fire only after completing essential duties, a reward system that doubled as practical heat distribution. Those who generated warmth through work earned the benefit of proximity to it. You can see the logic. Warmth, work, and rest intertwined best. Families with more resources, extra straw, wool, or even a small animal by the hearth, had a tangible advantage. Poorer households might rely solely on body heat and layered scraps, while wealthier ones could afford small luxuries that made the bitter nights more tolerable. Historians still argue whether these differences had long-term consequences for child survival or merely affected comfort levels. You imagine two cottages side by side, one cramped and straw-strewn, the other slightly more equipped, both navigating the same icy wind outside. You notice how carefully food is portioned. Children often receive small amounts of warming gruel or broth before bed, enough to fuel the night without spoiling the straw-stuffed beds. Fringe detail. Some parents believed sprinkling a pinch of salt into the nighttime meal improved circulation and thus warmth, a kind of folk science that may or may not have had physiological effects. You watch as a small girl licks the rim of a wooden bowl, eyes half-lidded, and you recognize a universal scene. Comfort, however modest, transmitted through nourishment. By the end of the night, it's evident that survival depends on careful planning, coordination, and resourcefulness. Food, labor, and warmth are inseparably linked. Every movement, every ration, every layer of straw or clothing contributes to a delicate ecosystem in which children can endure long, bitter winters. You feel the quiet orchestration of care, the rhythm of hunger, work, and warmth, and understand that medieval villages were systems of resilience, each tiny act reinforcing another in the fragile web of survival. The long night stretches on, and you begin to notice how children gradually transition from infancy to adolescence, carrying with them the lessons and rhythms of winter survival. Older children often sleep in slightly different arrangements, sometimes closer to the hearth if they've completed evening chores, sometimes on raised platforms with minimal bedding if resources are scarce. Historians still debate the precise age at which children assumed near-adult responsibilities, but the line between play and labor blurs quickly in these harsh environments. You watch a 12-year-old carefully checking the straw for damp spots, quietly reinforcing the bedding of a younger sibling, an unspoken lesson in both caregiving and endurance. Rites of passage into winter work are subtle but constant. A child might be entrusted with feeding the household animals through the night, or maintaining a small fire in a side room. Fringe detail. In some northern villages, preteens were given a tiny fire poker as a symbol of responsibility, a token that both empowered and warned. You notice the quiet pride in their movements, even as the cold nips at fingers and toes. Every night is training for survival, each task reinforcing skills that will carry them through harsh seasons and, potentially, their entire lives. Mortality, of course, lurks quietly in the background. Frostbite, illness, and malnutrition were persistent threats, and families learned to balance vigilance with practicality. You can see how rituals, layering strategies, and communal sleeping arrangements acted as buffers against these dangers. Historians still argue whether the combination of body heat, bedding improvisation, and fire management truly reduced mortality or simply improved comfort. But the evidence of ingenuity is clear. Even the smallest gestures, moving a blanket, sharing a swaddle, adjusting a hearth ember, become acts of life preservation. Despite the seriousness of survival, there's still room for creativity and comfort. Lullabies, whispered stories, charms, and seasonal rituals all continue to play a role in keeping children soothed. Fringe detail. Some communities celebrated winter nights by allowing children to stay up slightly later, listening to tales while older siblings rotated the fire watch. You can see how small joys were threaded into necessity, reminding children and adults that even in hardship, life contains warmth beyond the physical. The night begins to soften toward morning. You notice a subtle shift in sound, the faint stirrings of adults preparing for chores, the soft murmur of children who've briefly awakened to tend animals, the crackle of firewood as it is replenished. You feel the layered complexity of the household, architecture, bedding, body heat, clothing, ritual, and communal care all interwoven to create a fragile but resilient system. Every breath, every whisper, every movement contributes to survival. And as you lie back, listening to the orchestrated quiet, you sense the profound endurance embedded in these villages, a testament to human ingenuity, care, and adaptability under winter's relentless grip. The first pale light of dawn begins to filter through frost-laced windows, softening the shadows that danced across the walls all night. You notice how the cottage now feels less like a chaotic struggle against cold, and more like a carefully balanced system. Bodies pressed together, layered straw, flickering firelight, and lingering scents of herbs and smoke all blend into a quiet warmth that seems almost sentient. Fringe detail. In some villages, parents would sprinkle a few drops of warm water on the floor near the hearth in the early morning to increase humidity and prevent chapped skin in children, a low-tech, tactile comfort that doubled as early hygiene. Historians still argue whether these small practices genuinely impacted child health, or were more about parental peace of mind. Older children rise first, stretching stiff limbs, moving carefully to avoid disturbing younger siblings still cocooned in straw and rags. You watch as they execute early morning rituals, tending small fires, checking for leftover embers, gathering animal feed, and sometimes carrying out simple maintenance on bedding to remove damp or flatten straw for reuse. Every movement is deliberate, a silent lesson in responsibility and efficiency. You can almost feel the rhythm that has been passed down for generations, each gesture imbued with practical wisdom. Breakfast is humble but functional. A bowl of porridge or thin gruel, occasionally a piece of dried meat or salted fish, consumed quickly to conserve energy and heat. Fringe detail: some families would add a pinch of local herbs to the morning meal, believing it strengthened circulation and warmed the body from the inside out. You observe the subtle choreography. Children spooning cautiously, older siblings watching to ensure no spills, parents stirring the pot with the care of someone whose life depends on small details. Historians still debate whether this ritualized meal timing directly contributed to survival or was a cultural adaptation to extreme environmental demands. The cottage's architecture continues to play a vital role as morning light shifts the temperature subtly. Sunlight through tiny windows warms one side of the room, allowing the most vulnerable children to be moved closer to the warmth, while older siblings continue chores. Smoke holes and raised platforms remain functional, regulating air quality while maximizing comfort. Fringe detail: Some families would drape extra cloth over windows at night to trap heat, only to remove them in the morning to let in light, a simple but effective method that demonstrates awareness of thermal dynamics in a rudimentary way. By mid-morning, you can feel a subtle sense of rhythm in the household, an ebb and flow between labor, warmth, and care. Children who were curled in tight clusters are now more spread out, playing or helping with chores, bodies warmed by both sleep and layered strategies employed overnight. The night's lessons in endurance, layering, and shared heat are already internalized, guiding movements and decisions with unconscious precision. You realize that medieval winter life was less a series of chaotic hardships and more a complex, interwoven system of care, observation, and adaptive ingenuity. An ecosystem where survival relied on attentiveness, creativity, and quiet ritual. By late morning, the village begins to stir more fully, and you notice how the lessons of the long night carry seamlessly into daytime routines. Children emerge from their straw-lined beds, stretching and blinking against the soft glow of the sun, carrying with them the warmth retained from layered clothing and close body contact. Fringe detail. In some northern villages, parents instructed children to rub snow gently on cheeks for a few seconds before breakfast, believing it shocked circulation awake and prepared the body for outdoor labor. Historians still debate whether this practice actually conferred any real health benefits or was mostly ritualized discipline. Older children often help manage the household's seasonal demands. You watch them fetch water from frozen wells, sweep snow from pathways, and gather firewood for the next night. These chores are extensions of the survival strategies honed during the previous night. Sharing warmth and layered fabrics continues. A younger sibling's coat might be temporarily lent to an older child venturing outdoors, while infants remain nestled under additional blankets. Fringe detail. In some regions, older children were tasked with keeping small fire pits going outside to thaw milk or water, demonstrating early responsibility and rudimentary heat management skills. You notice how food, labor, and sleep intertwine. Breakfast may be modest, but it provides energy for the physical demands ahead. Older children sometimes carry small portions of warmed gruel to infants or toddlers unable to reach the hearth. Historians still argue whether these acts were primarily about nutrition or social bonding, but either way, they reinforce interdependence. You see the subtle choreography, each family member adjusting roles and routines to maximize survival, comfort, and efficiency in a cold and unforgiving environment. Architecture and interior design continue to influence the day. Wattle and daub walls retain heat captured overnight, and thatched roofs insulate against lingering cold drafts. You note fringe practices like temporary cloth partitions used to create warmer microenvironments for children or small animals. These seemingly small details amplify the effect of bedding and clothing strategies, demonstrating a remarkable understanding of microclimate management long before thermometers or central heating existed. As the sun climbs higher, you can observe patterns of resilience taking root. Children imitate caretaking behaviors learned overnight, layering blankets for dolls or moving straw mats to create warmer sleeping spaces for siblings. Fringe detail. Some villages even had a ritual of rearranging bedding daily to refresh warmth, a practice blending superstition and practical hygiene. Historians still debate whether these repeated routines materially reduced illness or primarily offered psychological comfort. Either way, you feel the cumulative effect. Centuries of adaptive strategies, rituals, and communal care shaping the lives of children to endure harsh winters with ingenuity, resourcefulness, and quiet resilience. As the afternoon stretches on, the village settles into a rhythm that echoes the night's lessons, but now infused with sunlight and slightly less urgency. Children play near the hearth or outside in shallow snowdrifts, laughter muffled by scarves and layered hoods. You notice how their bodies carry the memory of the night, the warmth of layered clothing, the subtle lessons of huddling, the imprint of attentive caretaking. Fringe detail. In some northern communities, children were taught to build miniature straw beds for younger siblings or toys outdoors, a playful practice that also reinforced skills in insulation and layering. Historians still argue whether these playful exercises were purely educational or a natural extension of children's instinctual play. But either way, the effect is visible. Warmth, ingenuity, and survival lessons intertwine.